So I'm talking about the inclusion obsession. And we hear a lot about inclusiveness, and it's apparently very important, but the topic is never discussed analytically. The idea seems to be that it's warm and fuzzy and just obviously a good thing. So the result is that the social world is being radically transformed for the sake of a goal that hasn't been thought through. So with that in mind, it seems a good idea to ask what it is, what it does, and where it comes from. Its nature is fairly simple. It's the egalitarian welfare state applied to social environment. Every one of us is supposed to experience the social environment as equally accepting and affirming. That's why discrimination and exclusion are supreme evils. They don't accept and affirm. With that in mind, inclusiveness demands changes that go to the heart of how people deal with each other. For example, it doesn't like the idea that particular kinds of people can be more or less suitable for particular positions. More or less suitable means discrimination, and training and job design are supposed to take care of all that. So if you're running the Navy, you're expected to put women not only on submarines, but in the SEALs. There may seem to be issues, but it's your job to find a way around them. Nor does inclusiveness like people to rely on common or complementary qualities when they form functional relationships. Some people don't have those qualities, and that leaves them out. So inclusiveness doesn't like old boy networks and so on. The idea seems to be that people who live and work together should build relationships based exclusively on common humanity, impersonal qualifications like academic degrees, and common devotion to fairness, diversity, and organizational mission statements. Specific understandings of marriage and family also have to go. Love and connectedness take many forms, and none can be preferred to any other. Beyond that, inclusiveness doesn't like particular culture. That's the reason for things like the war against Christmas. If culture functions, so English people do English things in English settings, and Italian people do Italian things in Italian settings, that excludes others. So human relations have to be a combination of individual choice, managerial know-how, and psychological and social therapy. That applies the same way to everyone everywhere. If Frenchmen and Chinese work better with Frenchmen and Chinese, it's because they see things the same way and of similar habits, that has to change. The cooperative habits and informal knowledge that develop within culture and are responsible for the achievements of all civilizations have to be done away with. So the whole project is obviously disconnected from reality. It's radically at odds with how human life works. So it can be relied on to make people cruder, stupider, less functional, and more isolated. At some level, people know that. So most people find inclusiveness and its demands stupid and disruptive. But if it's so bad, and people know it, why are so many intelligent, experienced, and responsible people firmly committed to it? And why does everything count in its favor and nothing against it? People sometimes say it's because of the media or social pressure or competitive status seeking. All that's true in its way, but why do those forces all point in the same direction? Resentment mongering might explain some of it, but resentments are universal, and they're normally ignored or suppressed when unless they're considered justified. To some extent, the situation can be explained on semi-Marxist grounds. People whose position and wealth comes from money, bureaucratic status, and professional qualifications want to get rid of other competing principles of authority, like family, religion, local community, and particular culture. They don't like connections and distinctions like sex and culture that don't lend themselves to quantification, supervision, and control by those at the top. So it's not surprising that people at the top like inclusiveness, which says in effect that all those messy, opaque connections, distinctions, and authorities have to be done away with. Everything has to be put on a bureaucratic or monetary basis so it can be supervised and controlled. Experts, bureaucrats, lawyers, managers, therapists, and people with tons of money should run everything because they're the only ones who run the only institutions that are allowed to work. And in fact, the great age of inclusiveness has turned out to be the great age of inequality based on money, organizational position, educational qualification, and so on. Inclusiveness destroys connections among ordinary people, and with them the habits, attitudes, and arrangements that help them lead orderly, decent, and productive lives. That's why the last 20 years have made Oprah a billionaire and also reduced the average life expectancy of uneducated white women by 5 years. Still, that explanation is not satisfying either. If the populace turns into a degraded mass of not-so-functional people, like the ones Charles Murray and Theodore Dalrymple write about, that's not helpful if you're trying to run things. Also, people at the top really do believe in inclusiveness. It's their religion, it's viewed as an essential part of what it is to be a legitimate human being, and the higher someone's IQ and the more years of schooling he has, the more likely he is to believe in it. What that shows is that inclusiveness has to do with the basic way educated public thought now makes sense of human life. So it seems that its causes must be very basic indeed. They have to do with fundamental concepts of what's real, reasonable, and valuable that precede all particular judgments of reality and practicality. So what's going on? At bottom, inclusiveness comes out of the same attempt to make knowledge rigorous and human action sovereign over nature that led to modern science and technology. That may sound paradoxical, but it nonetheless seems pretty clear. The inclusivist demands I mentioned all insist on abolishing the effect of traditional social arrangements that can't be made clear and controllable, like those relating to sex, family, religion, ethnicity, and particular culture. Instead, we're supposed to have enlightenment, which means rule by arrangements that supposedly are simply rational, like neutral expert bureaucracies. The point of the newer arrangements is supposed to be achieving whatever goals people happen to have. We're not going to base anything on questionable claims about highest goods or objective moral order. Instead, we're going to go with preferences, which are concrete and demonstrable. Once we do that, though, equality becomes a natural standard. People equally have preferences, and their preferences are equally preferences, so all people and all preferences have an equal claim to fulfillment. One exception I should mention is that preferences that don't fit the system, like non-PC preferences, have to get kicked out. Now, one preference almost everyone has is the preference for the esteem of other people. So that has to be equalized as well. Esteem, after all, has to do with value, and value is thought to be subjective and therefore changeable through training. And since people give social respect very high priority, that kind of equality should get high priority as well. Exclusion violates that equality, so it has to be done away with. So in a very few steps, rationalizing ways of thought applied to the construction of social environment bring us to inclusiveness. And that is a paradox, since inclusiveness, among other things, is anti-scientific. It forbids inquiry, it crushes dissenters, insists on falsehoods, and has led to scientific fraud and in some cases physical force against researchers. And it has to do those things to exist. For an outlook on life to make sense, it must fit the world as it is. So if you insist on inclusiveness, you must insist that the world lends itself to it. The intellectual and political culture that insists on inclusiveness also insists that evidence, reason, neutral expertise, and science have the highest possible authority. Unfortunately, those things tell us that there are human differences that are both stubborn and important, and that's not helpful. So there's a problem, and the solution to the problem is absolute insistence that none of those things tell us what they tell us. In fact, they confirm the unique rationality of inclusiveness. If there seem to be conflicts with science, inclusiveness comes first, because it has to do with things people care about more. They care about their personal status and experiences more than they care about scientific results. Since science can't simply be discarded, the solution is to modify it, to bring it into conformity with the superior standard, which is inclusiveness. And to all appearances, pretty much everyone who matters agrees with that solution. When James Watson and Larry Summers got beaten up by the forces of inclusiveness, they didn't say the evidence says what it says, they agreed with their attackers. Now, the reason inclusiveness goes so wrong is that it's part of the attempt to make the technological outlook a general outlook on life, and that can't be done. You achieve rigor at the cost of narrowing focus, for example, by excluding qualitative issues in favor of what can be measured. So you can't make everything rigorous. In particular, social life can't be understood as mechanism. Human beings can't be turned into components, let alone equal components of an infinitely adjustable machine. And esteem can't be manufactured and divided up equally. If you try to do that, you end up with all sorts of weirdness. The reason the technological outlook is pushed beyond its limits is that it is seen as uniquely valid. And that's important when you get to questions of basic social principle. A social order needs to be seen as entitled to respect, and it becomes entitled to respect by expressing the accepted understanding of what makes sense. Today, it's a technological understanding that people find convincing, so the social order has to express that understanding. Otherwise, people won't be able to look at it and say, that makes sense, so I'll go with it. That requirement, paradoxically again, leads to inclusiveness. Technology doesn't distinguish good and bad purposes, so the social order shouldn't either. Free to be you and me has to be the watchword. Technology doesn't distinguish beneficiaries, so the social order should be egalitarian. Everybody should get what he wants equally and be treated equally. Technology wants to control the whole of visible reality because modern science aims at that kind of universal understanding. So social engineering should apply to everything in sight, and the government is responsible for the total social environment. To give up on that responsibility would be to give up on the application of reason to human life. It would say that the form of reason that defines rational action, which is now thought to be technology, applies to producing and distributing hamburgers, but not to producing and distributing things we care about much more, like social position. People find that intolerable because man is a social and rational animal who needs to believe that the social principles that define who he is and demand his allegiance and tell him what he should respect and disdain are reasonable in the highest degree. Otherwise, he won't really accept them or accept the authority of the social order they define. He'll think of it as an arbitrary alien force that he wants to get out from under. People don't want to live like that, and social authorities don't want them to take that view. So the authorities are always going to identify themselves and what they do with what is considered highest and most reasonable and authoritative. Now, it's worth noting that what matters from the standpoint of social authority is technology as image and ritual rather than actual technology. Actual technology is a boring drudge that sometimes helps you and sometimes doesn't. In order to become the highest social principle, it has to become symbolic. It's a function of institutions like the Supreme Court and figures like Barack Obama to make it so. What the Supreme Court is supposed to do is dress up in robes, engage in rituals, and produce oracles that tell us that the legal order is fully rational and politically correct. And our current president, just by being what he is and performing ritual acts like giving speeches and appearing on The View, is thought to dispel dark and irrational forces and bring us into a new world of freedom, equality, and enlightenment. It is on such rituals that political legitimacy depends in an age that attempts to be comprehensively and consistently technological. Now, if what I say is so, and the problem is the merger of the technological and the sacred, what do we do about it? The obvious way in concept back to sanity is an understanding of reason that makes it possible to think about human relations and the social order in a more rational way. In principle, such an understanding will make a great deal of sense on several grounds. The point of modern science and technology is exact prediction and control. That means that it emphasizes quantity and specific causal mechanism. That's why people want statistics and studies when you talk about anything whatever today. That way of thinking is extremely powerful where it applies, but its usefulness eventually runs out. For example, the normal way to understand extremely complex evolved functional systems, like human societies, is not mathematics and mechanism, but experience and typical configuration, functioning, and goals. In other words, the usual key is how things normally look and how they normally work. So it's a matter of experience, judgment, and tradition, really, rather than anything that's terribly quantitative. So the obvious way out of the hole we're in is to embed scientific reason, which emphasizes number and what Aristotle called material and efficient cause. That is to say, the stuff that you're doing something with and the immediate force that causes that stuff to do things, within a larger conception of reasonableness that allows us to deal with situations where the methods of the natural sciences don't tell us very much. In other words, to add quality, tradition, classical natural law, and something like Aristotle's formal and final cause, that is, considerations of essential form, of typical configuration, and characteristic goal, characteristic mode of functioning to the mix. All of which is a very long story with lots of complications and lots of difficulties. Because what you're trying to do is trying to change what's considered the highest and most authoritative form of reasoning. You're saying that technology can't really be treated that way. You have to go to some broader conception of reason. And that's quite difficult to make that kind of fundamental change. And I don't have time today to explain exactly how all that is to be done. If you want to, you can read a bit more about it in my book on inclusiveness, which takes a non-technical, rather vernacular approach to those kinds of issues, and take it from there. And so with that, I'll pass the baton, or the torch, to our next speaker.